There's a specific kind of silence that settles over a room when something unexpected shifts the air. Not the silence of awkwardness or confusion. Something heavier than that. The kind where 200 people hold their breath at the exact same moment, and you can hear the candles flickering on the tables. I've stood in the middle of that silence twice in my life. The first time, I was 11 years old, watching my father sign the papers that kept our family farm outside of Sudbury. He didn't say anything. He just set down the pen and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the snow, and nobody spoke for a long time. The second time was at my brother's wedding reception, 3 weeks ago, in a banquet hall in Ottawa. And my father was there for that one too. I keep coming back to a message he sent me the morning of the wedding. I'd been awake since 5, ironing my dress uniform in the bathroom of my hotel room so I wouldn't wake my roommate. It was the kind of October morning that Ottawa does particularly well. Cold and perfectly clear, the sky so blue it almost hurt. I had the bathroom fan on and my phone on the counter, and the notification came through at 6:47 a.m. You always find a way to make everything about yourself. This is Alex's day. Try to remember that. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the counter, and finished ironing the sleeve I was working on. That was my father. 41 words before 7 in the morning. I want to be honest here, because I think honesty is the only way any of this sense. I didn't cry. I'd like to say I did, because that would make me sound like a more feeling person. But the truth is I'd been preparing for some version of that message for about 20 years. You develop a kind of callus. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It just means the hurt goes somewhere deeper than tears. I hung the uniform on the back of the bathroom door and looked at it for a long moment. 32 medals. 14 years of service in the Canadian Armed Forces. 2 overseas deployments, 1 in Latvia as part of Operation Reassurance, 1 in Mali under Operation Presence, a commendation from the Chief of Defense Staff, and a promotion, just 8 months earlier, to Lieutenant Colonel. None of which my father had acknowledged, not once, not in a card, or a phone call, or even a forwarded news article when the Sudbury Star ran a small piece on me 3 years ago. My mother had called to tell me about it. He'd been in the next room when she called. I could hear the hockey game in the background. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you try to tell a story you've been living inside of for so long. You have to go back further. I grew up on a mixed farm about 40 minutes outside of Sudbury. My father's family had been on that land for 3 generations. And if you wanted to understand everything about how he moved through the world, you only had to understand how he felt about that farm. It wasn't just property. It was identity. It was proof that a man had done something that mattered. There were 3 of us kids. Alec is 2 years older than me. My younger sister, Nora. Wait, I need to use a different name. That's a name from an old project. Call her. She goes by Meg, short for Margaret, named after my grandmother. Alec was always going to take over the farm. That was settled before any of us were old enough to have opinions. He was the oldest. He was a boy, and he loved the land in a way that seemed to satisfy something in my father that I never fully understood. When Alec was 16 and already talking about agricultural science programs, my father looked at him, the way people look at something they've built themselves. Meg was, by every measure, the daughter my parents had hoped for. She was warm and funny and practical. She married young, a good man, a contractor from Espanola, and they had 2 kids before she was 30, and my parents drove up for every birthday party, and never once complained about the distance. And then there was me. I was 15 when I saw a recruiting video for the Canadian Armed Forces on a school computer. I remember it clearly. I'd stayed late after class to use the internet because we had dial-up at home, and it was painfully slow. And I clicked on something by accident, and watched a 30-second clip of a group of soldiers moving through a forest exercise, and something clicked into place that I didn't have words for yet. I printed out the information page and folded it into my science textbook, and carried it home. It took me 3 months to bring it up at dinner. My father's response was not anger exactly. It was something quieter and more lasting than anger. He set down his fork and looked at me and said, "That's not a career. That's for people who don't have options." My mother said nothing. Alec looked at his plate. Meg, who was 12, and therefore immune to the social codes the rest of us lived under, said she thought it sounded cool. My father went back to eating. That was the conversation. That was the whole thing. I enrolled anyway. I was 17 when I started the application process for the regular officer training plan through Royal Military College, and I was accepted before I turned 18. I remember the letter arriving on a Tuesday in March, and I remember standing at the mailbox at the end of the driveway in my winter boots with the snow melting around me. Reading it 3 times, because I wanted to be sure I had it right before I went inside. My father was in the barn when I told him. He was fixing a piece of equipment. Something with the tractor, I don't remember what, and he looked up when I came in, and I handed him the letter. He read it. He handed it back. He said, "You're throwing away a good life for nothing." And then he turned back to the tractor. I was 18 years old. I stood there in the barn for another minute or two, holding my acceptance letter, listening to the sound of him working. And then I went inside and called my grandmother. My mother's mother, who lived in Timmins. And I told her and she cried, and that was the celebration. Military college is. I don't know how to describe it to someone who hasn't been through it. It's not what people picture when they imagine it. It's not cinematic. It's early mornings and physical exhaustion and academic pressure stacked on top of each other, in a way that requires you to be precise about how you spend every hour. I loved it in a way that surprised me. Not the difficulty, the clarity. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly what was expected of me and what I needed to do to meet it. I went home for Christmas in my first year. My father asked me, once, whether I'd changed my mind. I said no. He didn't ask again. Over the years, I stopped expecting things from him. That sounds colder than it was. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't the kind of father who yelled or belittled or made you feel small on purpose. He was the kind who simply withdrew, who withheld in ways so quiet you could almost convince yourself you'd imagined them. Holidays were fine. Dinner conversations were fine. He asked about my postings and I answered, and he nodded and asked Alec about the harvest yield. My mother was different. My mother came to my commissioning ceremony at RMC, with her sister and my grandmother, and she cried the entire time and apologized for crying, and then cried more. She sent me packages when I was deployed. Nothing useful, mostly baked goods that arrived flattened and slightly stale, and the occasional magazine she thought I might like. She called on Sundays. She was careful always about what she said in front of my father, but with me alone she was warmer. I didn't fully understand that distinction until much later. My work took me across the country and eventually overseas. I did a posting in Edmonton, then one in Gagetown, then a year in Kingston coordinating training logistics, which sounds administrative but was one of the most technically demanding things I've done. I was in my late 20s by then and had been promoted twice. I had a small apartment, a cat named Douglas who hated everyone, and a close group of people I'd served alongside who I trusted completely. My personal life was, I'll be honest, fairly sparse. I'd had 2 serious relationships, both with people who understood the demands of military life because they lived them too, and both ended without drama, but with a sadness I've never quite been able to articulate. There's a particular loneliness in choosing a life that doesn't leave a lot of room for the things other people build their lives around. But I was good at my job. I was genuinely, measurably good at it. My first overseas deployment was in 2018. Latvia. I came home thinner and more careful with my words, which is the most honest description I can give. My father met me at the airport with my mother and Meg and Alec. He shook my hand, that was it. My brother hugged me so hard he lifted me off the ground. My sister cried. My mother held my face in her hands and didn't say anything, just looked at me for a long moment, like she was checking that everything was still in the right place. My father shook my hand. I told myself it didn't matter. I had been telling myself that for years by then, and I'd gotten quite practiced at it. In the years between my first deployment and this past October, I was promoted twice more. The rank of lieutenant colonel put me in command of a significant number of personnel, and a scope of responsibility I still sometimes have to remind myself is real. I was 34 years old. My commendation from the CDS came after the Mali deployment and a particularly complicated logistics operation that I can't discuss in detail but that I am quietly proud of, in the way I'm proud of most things I've worked for. Not loudly, not publicly, just factually. My father called me 3 times during those years, for reasons not related to family logistics. Once when the furnace broke, and he wanted to know if I knew a good repair company in Sudbury. I did not, but I found him one. Once to tell me that the Andersons up the road had sold their property. I didn't know them well, but I said I was sorry to hear it. And once, about 2 years ago, to ask if I could loan him money for a piece of farm equipment. I said yes. I transferred the monies that same day. We did not discuss it again. When Alec called to tell me he was getting married, I cried a little. Happy tears. Alec is a genuinely good person, and his fiancée, whom I'd met twice at family dinners, was warm and funny, and clearly loved my brother in a way that was easy to see. The wedding was set for October, in Ottawa, where she grew up, and where they'd built their life together. He asked me to be there. I said of course. What I didn't know, when I agreed, was that the wedding reception venue would also be hosting a regimental dinner, the same evening. An annual dinner for a regiment whose officers included several people I'd served alongside over the years. Alec's fiancé's uncle was a retired warrant officer, and through that connection, the venue had been booked months in advance for both events, one in the main ballroom and one in the adjacent hall. The seating arrangements were complicated. The 2 events would share a lobby and a bar area during the cocktail hour. I found this out 4 days before the wedding, when my mother called to confirm some family logistics. She mentioned it casually. Then she paused and said, "You might want to wear a regular dress." I understood what she meant. My dress uniform as a lieutenant colonel with my service record is noticeable. It is not subtle. She was asking me, gently, in the way she had always asked things of me, to make myself smaller, to not be the thing that drew attention. I thought about it. I genuinely thought about it. And then I thought about my father's message, which I'd been carrying around all week like a stone in my coat pocket. You always find a way to make everything about yourself. I thought, wearing a blazer and slacks to my brother's wedding, instead of my dress uniform, is not something I'm willing to do. Not because I want to draw attention, but because the uniform is what I am. It is 34 years of my life distilled into fabric and metal, and I am not going to fold it up and put it in a bag because it makes someone uncomfortable. I called Alec. I asked him directly, did he have any preference about what I wore to the reception? He was quiet for a second. Then he said, Lennox, wear your uniform. I want you there as yourself. His fiancée, who was apparently in the room, said something in the background. Alec laughed and said, she says you'd better, actually. She wants her aunt to see it. So I went. I need to tell you about the cocktail hour, because it matters. The venue was a restored heritage building near the Rideau Canal. High ceilings, original woodwork. The kind of place that makes you instinctively stand up a little straighter. The wedding guests and the regimental dinner guests were mixing in the lobby before the event separated, and I'd walked in and immediately found Alec and his new wife and hugged them both. And I was standing with my mother's sister and her husband, drink in hand, having a perfectly pleasant conversation about the drive up from the Saw, when I noticed. I noticed people noticing, not the wedding guests. Or not primarily the wedding guests, the regimental dinner guests, several officers I'd served with, a few had commanded. There's a particular way that military personnel make eye contact when they recognize rank and service. It's quick, almost involuntary, a kind of automatic calibration. I caught 3 pairs of eyes in about 30 seconds. One of them was a man I'd served with in Gagetown 15 years ago. He was a major now. He saw me across the lobby and his expression changed, and he stood a little straighter. My father was across the room, standing with Alec's new in-laws. I could see him from where I was. He was watching me. I turned back to my aunt and picked up the thread of the conversation. The reception began to move into the main hall around 7. The regimental dinner was in the adjacent room. They'd be going in at the same time. There was a brief overlap in the corridor. I was walking beside Meg when it happened. The major from Gagetown was walking toward the other room with a group of officers, and he stopped when he saw me and said my name. Just my name and then my rank the way you do. Lennox. Lieutenant Colonel. I shook his hand and said it was good to see him. He said, a minute, ma'am. I want to make sure my CO knows you're here. I told him it wasn't necessary, truly, that I was at a family event and didn't want to interrupt their evening. He smiled and said, with respect, ma'am, he'd want to know. He was gone for about 90 seconds. What happened in those 90 seconds is that somehow, I don't know how information moves as fast as it does in military contexts, but it does, it always does. Somehow, the word got back to the regimental dinner that a lieutenant colonel with 2 overseas deployments and a CDS commendation was in the building. What happened next, I was not expecting. The doors to the adjacent hall opened, and they came out. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that when they lined the corridor, there wasn't room to walk through without walking between them. 50, maybe 60 officers and personnel. Some in mess dress, some in uniform. Standing at attention in the corridor of a heritage building in Ottawa on a Saturday night in October. And someone, a colonel I'd met once, briefly years ago, called out in a voice that carried clearly into the main hall where the wedding reception was just beginning to settle into its seats. Officer on parade. And they came to attention. The sound of it. Dress shoes on hardwood. The specific percussion of military personnel snapping to attention simultaneously. Cut right through the ambient noise of 200 wedding guests finding their seats. The hall went quiet. I stood in the corridor and looked at them, and felt something I didn't have a name for. Not pride. Exactly. It was something more complicated than pride. Something that 14 years of early mornings and physical exhaustion, and loneliness, and being good at something that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally had decided wasn't worth their respect. I came to attention. I acknowledged the colonel. I thanked them. The colonel said, the honor is ours, ma'am. And then the wedding guests, who had gone completely silent, began to clap. Not politely. Not the way you clap because everyone else is clapping. The way people clap when something unexpected has moved them. Uneven at first, then building, then sustained. I turned to walk into the reception hall. My father was standing 6 feet away. He was not clapping. He was very still. He was looking at me the way I imagine he'd looked out the window the night he signed the papers on the farm. Like something had shifted that he hadn't been prepared for. I looked at him for a moment. I didn't say anything. I walked to my seat. Dinner was what it should have been, focused on Alec and his wife, as it should be. The speeches were good. Alec cried during his toast to her, which made everyone else cry, which was exactly right. I sat with Meg and her husband, and a couple of Alec's university friends, and I laughed more in 3 hours than I had in months, which told me something about how I'd been spending my time. My father sat at the head table. He and I didn't speak during dinner. It was near the end of the evening. The music had started, people were moving to the dance floor, and I was standing near the bar talking to Alex's new mother-in-law, who was asking me about the medal on my left breast pocket with genuine curiosity. When my mother appeared at my elbow, she said, "Can I steal her for a minute?" Alex's mother-in-law smiled and stepped away, and my mother took my hand and led me toward a quieter corner near the coat check. She was carrying a small cloth bag, the kind of bag you'd use for a bottle of wine as a gift. She handed it to me. She said, "I've been holding on to this for a long time. I didn't know when to give it to you. Tonight seems right." Inside the bag was a shoebox. Inside the shoebox were, I don't know exactly how many, dozens. Newspaper clippings, printed emails, a couple of photographs, the Sudbury Star piece from 3 years ago, a printout of a Department of National Defense announcement about my commendation, with the date circled in pen. A photograph someone had taken of me at the RMC commissioning ceremony in 2008, which I hadn't known she had. A note from my grandmother, written and never sent, addressed to me. I stood in the corner by the coat check, holding a shoebox full of 17 years of my mother paying attention. I couldn't speak for a moment. She said, "He was proud of you too. He just didn't know how to say it. I'm not making excuses for him. I'm just telling you the truth." I said, "Mom." She said, "I know." We stood there for a minute. She put her hand on my arm. Outside, the dance floor music got louder. Eventually, I put the lid back on the box, and put it back in the bag, and held it in one hand, and she straightened my shoulder boards, the way she used to adjust my backpack straps when I was little, and we walked back into the reception together. My father found me near the end of the evening. I was outside on the venue's terrace, which overlooked the canal, getting some air. It was cold the way Ottawa is cold in October, sharply, cleanly, the kind of cold that clears your head. I had my coat on, over my uniform, and I was holding a cup of coffee, and looking at the lights reflecting on the water. He came and stood beside me. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. He said, "The things I said to you, over the years." He stopped. I waited. He said, "I was wrong about what you could do. I didn't understand it. I'm not sure I understand it now, but I know I was wrong." It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more awkward than that. A man in his late 60s, trying to account for 20 years of silence, standing on a terrace in the cold with inadequate words. I've thought about that conversation many times since, and I think the inadequacy was honest, and I've come to value honest inadequacy over polished insincerity. I said, "I know." He said, "Alex says you're doing important work." I said, "I am." He said, "Good." We stood there for another minute. The canal was very still. I said, "I'm glad I came tonight." He said, "Me too." That was the whole conversation. We went back inside. He danced with my mother. I danced with Meg and then with Alec, who held my hand through one slow song and didn't say anything, just sort of held on, which I understood completely. I drove back to Kingston the next morning. It's about a 2-hour drive on the 416, and then the 401, through flat land and scattered towns, and the kind of landscape that looks like it should be boring, but somehow never quite, as if you've grown up somewhere similar. I had the shoebox on the passenger seat. I'd looked through it again that morning, properly, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed before I finished packing. There were things in there I hadn't known about. A local radio interview that someone had transcribed for her. I hadn't known the interview had been picked up at all. A printout of a profile someone had written about women in the Canadian Armed Forces, with my name highlighted in one paragraph. She had kept all of it, organized, in a shoebox, in a bag she'd apparently been carrying to this wedding for weeks before deciding when to give it to me. I thought about all the Sunday phone calls, all the flattened baked goods, all the years she'd been paying attention in a quiet room while the hockey game played in the background. I don't have a clean ending for any of this. Life doesn't give you clean endings. It gives you Tuesday mornings and long drives and boxes of things you didn't know someone had been keeping for you. What I have is this. I am 34 years old. I have done work that mattered. I have people in my life who see me clearly. I have a brother who wanted me there as myself, and a mother who spent 17 years clipping newspaper articles and putting them in a shoebox, and a father who stood on a terrace, in the cold, and said I was wrong in the most inadequate and honest way he could manage. And I have a long drive home, through a flat and familiar landscape, with a shoebox on the passenger seat and a cup of coffee getting cold in the cup holder, and somewhere, outside of Brockville, the sun comes fully up over the fields and turns everything briefly gold. That's enough. I've decided that's enough.